brook trout, I moved back to Northeast Oregon in like 2008 and started working in the basin and hiking the Eagle Cap Wilderness. And from that point, I've always been really passionate about bull trout. And so I have wanted to do some brook trout removals and work on getting rid of brook trout for a long time. And so this is kind of a pet project of mine. Um, and it was a pretty short timeline that we kind of jumped into this. It was like Mike had sent me a paper, and I was like, that was interesting. And then it might have been November, and by the next summer, we were already working on this. So I dove in pretty quick. So really interesting project. I'm gonna start off letting you know, because I don't really say it early. This is mostly a mechanical removal project. It's all mechanical removal to gill nets and electrofishing. That's all we've done so far. So you know that going in, you have that information. Okay, I'm going to talk about Bear Creek Watershed. For those of you that don't know, if you have one of those maps around, it's on there. It is a tributary to the Wallowa River. The confluence is just downstream of Wallowa, right near that new bridge that they just built. Most of it in the area that I'm going to be working in and talking about today is located within the Eagle Cap Wilderness. There's not very many tributaries up there. There's like Granite Creek and Miners Basin Creek. Is that what it is? There's pretty much no fish up there except for brook trout. On this map here, there's these two X's. Those are some barriers that Mike and Laura have gone and checked out. And that off the lower one happens to be the end of bull trout distribution, and also likely has always been the historic barrier for anadromy. And so above that point, it's all brook trout, except for there's a few rainbows that we're not sure how they got there or what they're doing up there in that one creek. So it's all brook trout up there. So what that does is it makes it pretty well suited to go just kind of do our thing. We don't have to worry about ESA listings and all that stuff up there, because we've only really got one fish to deal with. So it sets up really well for an eradication project like this. And if we decided we wanted to do a chemical removal project in the future, those barriers set up real nice, because there's those two that we could potentially use that as like a decontamination zone before we got down where we have to worry about our ESA listed fish. So it sets up real nice. At the very head of the lake, or at the basin, is two lakes. There's Little Bear Lake, which is just this kind of little tiny puddle, and then there's Bear Lake. Bear Lake has brook trout in it. They've been there since probably the 1910s, long time. And so um, it's kind of perched up on the very top. And then as we go down, there's some barriers, and I'll talk more about those barriers. But just brook trout in those two lakes. So really the objective of the project is to eradicate brook trout. That is the main thing. So the idea is we can eradicate brook trout up top, get less fallout. They won't move down into the areas where we do have our listed fish like bull trout. So most of you probably know, I'm guessing, but the brook trout are known to hybridize with bull trout, which causes problems. In other basins, they've completely extirpated bull trout. We're pretty lucky. We've got a really strong fluvial component of fish that probably helps us hang on to those fish. And then one of the good things about this situation is we got a lot of barriers in here, and it prevents, as we move downstream, it'll prevent brook trout from moving back up into the areas where we've already worked. So this project started in July, late July. It was July and early August of 2024. We figured we needed to go up there and figure out what we were looking at. That was kind of the main thing. So I'm going to start this first 5 or 6 slides of this from here is just going to be talking about what we did in 2024, and then I'll progress from there. So we wanted to estimate abundance, just wrap our heads around like how many fish are we dealing with, mostly like in orders of magnitude, right? Like, are we dealing with a few hundred, or are we dealing with a few thousand? Kind of where does that sit? Because that contextually, when we start removing fish, it gives us an idea kind of how we're doing. Like if there's 3,000 fish in there and we go up there and we get 30, we're not doing very well, right? So just kind of to be able to wrap our heads around this. So um, we also wanted to describe the demographics. We wanted to look at ages, get an idea of the life history of these fish and how they're kind of progressing and when they become mature. So we can kind of get ahead of and tailor our approach to kind of remove the certain fish that we're after. And then kind of work through all the cohorts or hit them at the time that we can get to them best. So we wanted to really document the barriers, so we knew exactly what we were looking at when we start working downstream. I'll show those to you here in a second. They're pretty handy, but because that lake is perched, there's a bunch of barriers as you go down this real steep hill, which sets up nice for really discrete little sections for us to work in. And then we mapped everything. We mapped where those barriers are. We mapped all the inlet tributaries. We mapped barriers in the inlet tributaries, so we know where we need to remove fish from those. And we mapped the lakes, so we had a really good bathymetric map in case for some reason we do ever want to go back in with a chemical project. Um, and just kind of wrapping our whole head around what's the strategy for this place and how can we get this done. Um, So our abundance estimate was just a simple mark recapture. We went up and spent 2 days just angling and setting some really quick set gill nets to mark fish. So we either marked them with a Floyd tag or a caudal clip. And then after we got through those first 2 days, we installed 8 gill nets into Bear Lake and 2 into Little Bear Lake to start catching those fish. I can't see my whole slide up here. Um, so we ran those gill nets for 6 days, pulling all those fish out and taking lengths and weights on all those fish. So we could get that characterization. Our pop estimate came out a little bit below 1,000 fish, about what I kind of expected. Runs anywhere from around 500 to 1,500 fish. So that was just a good starting point. It wasn't the best pop estimate. The fish actually turned out to be pretty tough to catch. Um, so so we didn't get a ton mark, but it was good enough to kind of give me that management um, perspective of like, this is kind of where we're sitting. So we only caught 8 fish in Little Bear Lake. I'm going to talk a little more about Bear Lake. Gets a little bit glazed over in this talk. I do have one slide that I'll kind of summarize it. It's kind of a small part of this, but we only caught 8 fish in there. It's a really small component of this, but it is kind of one bright spot too. So, but I'll talk more about that here in a bit. So this is just the simple mapping that we did as a lake. So we took a fish finder up there and just ran transects across the lake. Took GPS coordinates and depth and then mapped it all out. The thing I really want you to take home from this is the size of the lake. Um, so the surface area of Little Bear Lake, we're looking at a little over a third of a hectare, and Bear Lake, we're looking at about 3 hectares. So the paper that I mentioned earlier that Mike had sent me, that I'm kind of basing this work on, they were working in a lake that was about 23 hectares, and they were able to be successful with a similar approach. So we're starting off pretty small, and because of that, we're actually able to have a lot higher relative effort than they did. So, and I'll show you more of that. But that's the big take home here is that these are relatively small compared to where this has been used. But what that did when we went in there and mapped all this was it gave us the ability to kind of strategize and build out how we're going to approach this. And so we're going to work from the top down. So I've got zone A, and that's where we're currently working. And we've been working the last year and a half, is really hitting those fish up there, trying to remove them. We're running gill nets. We're electrofishing all those little inlet tributaries and the outlet of the lake to try to get rid of all those fish. So the components that I haven't mentioned yet is that um, we're running over winter gill nets in these lakes. So we're actually setting gill nets under the ice. And that's so after our mapping, we went in the fall and did that. So, but then we'll work down. You can see all these barriers or these yellow points on the line as Bear Creek goes down the hill. And so you can see that gives us nice little discrete sections to work in. So we can put some real intense effort in these little tiny spots and then move down after we get done with zone A. But zone A, we're looking at probably a few years before we're either decide that we failed miserably or if we're successful. So as I mentioned, those barriers are a really important part of the removal strategy. It's 21 barriers within the first kilometer of the lake. So right there, I kind of went over all this. Oh, I do want to mention that these barriers are high confidence barriers. We didn't go in there and find anything that was these little steps and be like, yeah, maybe. These are all pretty substantial barriers. You can see this in this picture on the right side. It's cascadey. These are all definitely barriers. So we know we're not getting recolonization of fish going back up. Barrier A is that first one after you leave the lake, and it's a nice tall kind of civvy rock structure cascade that's pretty brutal. So we don't have fish moving back above that, and so that was a really great reach break for us to start and work in the lake above. So there's a few things that I wasn't really able to quantify real well when we were up there that I do want to cover, and one of them is the young of the year. Young of the year up there are extremely difficult to catch. They don't recruit to the gill nets, they just swim through them, and they also do not recruit to the e-fishing very well because the conductivity is so freaking low up there that we can literally be standing in a cloud of them and turn it on and they just swim away. Very difficult to catch them. You can get a few of them to turn, but extremely tough to catch them. So really our observations of the young of the year are just what we saw up there. Little Bear Lake, we didn't see any young of the year, which was interesting. There's not a lot of spawning habitat. We caught very few fish in there that were all big. Um, so that was a really interesting observation. On the other side, Bear Lake had a lot of young of the year in that first year, and that's an important observation for a little bit later. But like I said, they're not vulnerable to beagle net capture. We have to wait for those fish to grow up a little bit. But there were a bunch in both the tributaries and along the lake margins that we weren't able to really put our hands on very well. In general, a lot of these high lakes in the Eagle Cap Wilderness, you end up with these stunted brook trout. So they're all head and these little tiny skinny bodies. You get them in the elkhorns too. These fish aren't really like that. The lake has a kind of silty bottom, and these fish are eating a lot of chironomids. And they all seem to be in pretty healthy condition for the most part. I will tell you that I'm going to show you a graph here in a second. There's some electrofishing on there. We electrofish very little in 2024 because the electrofisher wouldn't work. We have a weird little spot of cell phone service. We were calling Smith Root, trying to get them to help us out, tried everything we knew. And then I left for the second half of the trip. And Mike tried the age-old solution of let's bang on it a little bit and see if it works. And it happened to work for him. So they did get a little bit of electrofishing in, but I don't want to, I put the data up here more as to show kind of some age classes and where those fish sat. The effort that we put into it was so low that it doesn't really mean anything, but it kind of shows you what size classes of fish we have in here. So these are which is here. These are the fish that we caught in that first effort in that 8 days that we were up there. So we ran the gill net, we electrofished, and then we had some angling effort, which was our mark. So this was interesting to get back and throw up on the computer and start looking at, because we got those young of the year way over there on the left that we did catch, like, I don't remember what it was, 20 or 30 of those in the outlet electrofishing once we got that working. So it kind of shows that young of the year component there. And then as we move in, we can see that around 100 millimeters, we started catching some age ones. That we did There was a little speculation that maybe we were just missing an age class in there, but after our work that we did in 2025, I'm pretty sure that it's not there. These fish are, that group of fish on the far left clearly showed up in 2025 in our gill nets. We were able to see them. So this is just kind of an initial look. This graph's going to come back up here in a few minutes in a comparison with what we saw this year. So one thing we did look at a little bit, and we probably should spend some more time on, is maturation. So in 2024, we cut a few fish open and looked at them, and at best, we saw some really tiny eggs. And we were like, I don't know if those fish are going to mature this year. And I kind of assumed they weren't, but it turns out that they were, because when we went and looked this year, there was clearly a lot of mature fish dead in our nets. So and typically brook trout are maturing at age 2, and it appeared that that was the case in 2024. When we went back in 2025, we're not sure that that's the case anymore. It looks like we might have some age 1s maturing, so which is a real bummer, because the more time we have before they start spawning, the more chances we have to catch them and get rid of them before they reproduce. So we do need to look at that a little harder when we're up there the next time and see where those fish are. And we'll also be looking for young of the year real hard again. Um, yeah. Oh, that's the slide. That's the bonus slide. You'll get to see that one later. So I mentioned Packus and Taylor. So they put in nearly 1,400 net nights per hectare over 5 years to remove the fish in that 23 acre or hectare lake set of lakes. We set gill nets on October 6th of 2024, and those nets sat until July 22nd of this year, when Laura and I went up there and pulled them. I had this vision in my head that we were going to have these nice little skeletonized fish stuck in our nets. I don't know why I was thinking that was going to be the case, but it was the first time I have ever gagged during fish work. It was so disgusting. Laura was there and was like, "Let me do that." Um, and so it was awful. It was just, I won't describe it. But so we pulled those nets, and Laura and I did our best to count and we had about 103 fish in Bear Lake. Well, it doesn't sound like very many. Um, it was really difficult to count those fish. Sometimes it was just like a grease stain in our net, and then we were like, yeah, that was probably a fish. When we that green kayak right there, when we pulled the nets into it, it just had mush in it. It was awful. And glad I only have to do that once a year. Um, but I when I was pulling nets into the kayak, I could see fish parts falling into the water column, and you could where the net was laid, you could see like suspended fish parts after we removed the net. And so I don't really know how many fish we caught in that effort. I know it was about 103 at the minimum, but it was extremely hard to tell what was going on. And Little Bear Lake, we actually only caught one fish over the entire winter, and that was it was a all we saw was the about this much of the center of a female with the eggs in her. But that fell out in the kayak, and when we pulled that net out of the boat, we'd have never counted that fish if I hadn't have seen it when I pulled it in. So I know we're missing some fish from this. They could have decomposed way early in the season, just completely gone, and we didn't ever see them. So this is really hard to quantify what we've got going on right here. One thing I would do want to point out is that in that effort, we had in Bear Lake, we had seven over almost 800 net nights per hectare. So we're almost already halfway to what Packus and Taylor did. But because we have such a small lake and we've just kind of overloaded it with nets, we're we're just able to crack up those numbers a lot faster. So we're gonna far exceed what they did. In Little Bear Lake, we've already have. And I will tell you that we've probably Little Bear Lake probably doesn't have any fish in it anymore. So this is the comparison of our 2024 effort to what we did this year. So we went in July when Laura and I were there, and then we went back in September to set our overwinter nets, but we stayed for a little bit because we thought it'd be beneficial to catch some of those fish while we were there and do some more electrofishing. But you can see that age one cohort um, in the top graph in the blue, um, that was our young of the year from the previous season that were all in the edges that I was telling you about and in the tributaries. So those fish definitely moved in. One thing that I found really interesting was how much they grew from July of 25 to September of 25. You can see that shift in that hump there. One thing, and you can see that spiked a little bit too. One thing about gill netting is fish become more vulnerable to gill nets the larger they get. You actually become far more efficient as you progress into this. So we saw a little bit of a spike there. Also, our young of the year grew a little bit and became a little more susceptible to electrofishing. You can see that in that September 2025 graph. But I mean, the big take home from this is you guys can see that shift from the age one pluses from the far right side to younger age classes. So we're definitely having an impact there. I'd say, being fairly effective at removing those larger, more fecund fish, which is um, it's encouraging. I'm still pretty optimistic about this project. I am a little bit concerned that we're still seeing a few big fish out there. I was hoping we'd be able to get through those in the first winter, and we didn't. Um, I don't think there's a whole lot of them out there. The so anything in July of 25 and September of 25 above like 195, those are all represented by single individuals pretty much, except for a couple of those bars. So we're talking less than 10 fish in both of those efforts that we caught. And when we were catching 100 fish or more. So there's not very many big fish out there. I think we've paid them pretty hard. We went a little earlier this year in September to get the nets in, hoping to get ahead of the spawn and catch more of them. It's part of the reason we were there in September this time instead of October, was we were trying to get ahead of them and try to kind of clean the rest of them out before we got there. We did see some evidence that some of these age one fish may be maturing this year, which is also not all that exciting. But um, this whole thing's been really interesting because I was super excited to get up there and see what we had, and was pretty encouraged by it. But now I'm like, oh, I can't wait for next year because it's really going to show us some new information. And my hope is this stuff starts to really flatline. But one observation I should say is with the young of the year that you're seeing here, I was saying you shouldn't put too much into like the abundance of those. When we were up there, it was noticeable how few young of the year there was compared to the year before. There was, I might have seen 20 or 30 fish in the margins of the lake, and then in the tributaries, just a few. They were really small, tough to catch, but it was very, very noticeable that there was a lot less young of the year in 2025. And so we're definitely having an impact on their reproduction to some point. I wish I could quantify that better, but I can't. So, um, so this is a CPUE adjustment on some of the same information. Um, because we set nets for different amount of time frame. So in the 2 trips in 2025, we were only there for 2 net nights or 2 nights to set nets, and in 2024, we were up there for 6. So I've adjusted the CPUEs on this, so you can kind of see a comparison of how we've shifted that age structure a little bit. What this is still a little bit of a biased graph because you do become more proficient at catching larger fish. And so the right side of the graph, it's probably a little biased towards the larger fish. So those bars would probably be a little shorter if I was able to adjust for that size. There is a way to do it. I just didn't have time to figure it out. So okay, my slide about Little Bear Lake. So we didn't see we haven't seen ever any young of the year in there. We caught those 8 fish and then we set nets all winter, 2 nets all winter in this little tiny lake that's maybe twice the size of this room. Um, and we caught 1 fish. And then in September, we took nets up there again, put 2 more nets in there, left them, didn't catch anything. I'm fairly certain that we don't have any fish left in Little Bear Lake. So success, I guess. Um, after 9 fish. I think there's no spawning gravel up there, no young of the year. I'm highly suspicious that anglers were taking them from Bear Lake and walking them up there. It's only maybe 100 yards between the two. And I think that's probably how those fish were getting in there. They were all larger age class fish that we caught in there. We didn't see anything under probably 225 millimeters. So and it, it definitely grows algae. There's not really a good connection. There's no inlet stream. So I'm pretty sure we've been successful there. We'll keep monitoring that. Every time we're up there, we'll throw a few nets in and just make sure we're not catching anything in there. But at this point, I'm pretty comfortable calling that eradicated. Eventually, we are going to try to get some eDNA going up here to just kind of confirm our suspicions once we think we've maybe been successful at some of these spots. So, okay, so at this point, we've removed 790 fish. So some of those are young of the year, which wouldn't have not have been included in our pop estimate because they weren't vulnerable to our gear. So, so some of those have recruited in and are counted in that number. I already kind of talked about our maturation. Um, we didn't see that in 2024, and now we are. I'm not sure if we've removed enough fish from the lake that there's been this release of food, and all these fish are doing so well that they're maturing faster. That's where they do see fish mature at age 1. It's typically higher productivity systems, and we may have provided that production. So there may be this kind of offset. Um, Mhm. Yeah, so we will be this thing cuts off the bottom one, my bottom bullet points. Oh, yeah, so those we do have nets in the lake currently fishing, and we'll be back up there to do the dirty part of the job in July. Um, and yeah, so I just wanted to go back and kind of review this Packus and Taylor stuff and just kind of show you what the difference is in our effort. I probably won't hit um, as many net nights in Little Bear Lake as I had originally intended, just because I think we're kind of already there. So, but we're in 4 years, we're gonna almost double what they put in per effort as far as net nights go. And this is the graph directly from their paper, kind of showing what their progression was. Their bar in 2002 was that was kind of like their initial go out to see what's going on. So they weren't really trying to remove fish at that point, and so they were able to accomplish this on 4 years. They were fishing all year, so we're missing most of August and most of September without nets. So there's 2 months, which may be the best jump months to catch fish. They did run through there, but I'm hoping that we're going to be able to maybe replicate what they did here and kind of be through it in 4 or 5 winters. But we're fishing right now. This is the slide that I promised you earlier. This was my probably over optimistic crack at figuring out how this was going to go. You can see that in one spot, it's like, oh, we're going to remove everything that was brood year 23 and earlier by early this year, which we clearly didn't do. But I had to kind of try to wrap my head around the life history of what these fish were, and it's kind of complicated when you start thinking about spawners and what fish are already out there and how it's all going to go. So this is kind of the conceptual plan of how this is going to go. I'm anticipating probably having to go out off the end of this a little bit, but it's basically we're shooting to remove the larger cohorts at a time, and then kind of start, and at the same time, kind of start working on the one behind them, and then get them before they're really productive. So, but I'm hoping to have a lot more information next year for everybody that gives you a little more hope. So, but right now I'm optimistic. There's still a chance this doesn't work, but I do want to quickly thank the people that have helped us. So part of the reason I started this project was because I wanted to. I told you earlier I wanted to take action on brook trout. Um, and I don't have a lot of resources. So in the watershed that I work in, it's Ethan, myself, and an assistant biologist. There's three of us, so we don't have a lot of resources. We're fairly limited there. So we got a lot of help from the Nez Perce tribe this year and last year to go up there, and then Jan and Laurel came up with us with their tech a few years ago. And then I got a $5,000 grant from the Oregon Wildlife Foundation, and that's really the only money we've spent besides staff time on this is 5 grand, and then a few odds and ends here and there. So it's really a shoestring project. But my philosophy on invasive species removal is that it's really difficult to do, and I think a lot of people get scared off of it, um, and including myself. Um, but I think unless we start doing something, then we're never going to learn how to do it. And one thing that I've noticed about as we work through this project is I have already started tweaking like what gill net we bought new gill nets and started like trying to focus in on specific sizes. And we're already learning how to do it better. And just by getting up there and getting our hands dirty, literally, uh, I'm already kind of learning how to fine tune this and hoping to move on to some other places if we start seeing some success soon, and maybe being able to use that as leverage to get some resources. So, but this was kind of a let's just go and get it done, and it's relatively low effort on our part. We did spend we had the minimum would be 2 staff for 2 weeks up there a year. And that's pretty doable for what we have for resources. It's not something where we have to have techs on the ground all the time. So that's kind of where we're at with it. So, and I can take questions.
Thanks, Kyle. My question is, what kind of public outreach and education efforts have you had, and what has the response been?
Um, a lot of you in the room probably get the emails that I send out occasionally that I just kind of update people on what we're doing with the district. A lot of that's about 300 people, including newspapers, that I send this email out to. And I have mentioned this project in there and kind of detailed what we've been up to. Um, that's basically it. I haven't done a ton of outreach. You guys may have seen a couple months ago, Jason Jacoby out of the Baker paper published an article on it. And um, I didn't really get much heat besides the state senator texting me on my personal phone to tell me he didn't like it. But really, I haven't had much pushback otherwise. And the thing I try to remind people is I think just within my district, there's 63 lakes that have brook trout in them within the Eagle Cap Wilderness. Like, we are not removing real opportunity here. There's opportunities to catch brook trout all over the wilderness, and so um, and I'm used to taking heat on things. When you run fisheries, we have people calling us all the time that are unhappy with what we're doing, but I can't make everybody happy. So this is important. One thing I didn't mention is that um, for the um, Palau Minum core area, the bull trout, they only have two primary threats listed in the recovery plan, and that is water quality and quantity, which I'm not touching because you guys are all in here pretty much doing that on the salmon and steelhead side. You're taking care of that. And then the other one is invasive species, and it's brook trout. And so I have the ability. I'm not BPA funded. I'm funded by licensed dollars and general fund. So I kind of get to pick and choose what I do. And I'm one of the few people that has the freedom to go do this stuff. And so I kind of just went for it. Um, and like I said, it happened pretty quick. So there hasn't been a ton of outreach, but it has been put out there in the world, and I figure people will come after me if they need to. So
course, each day follow up as you specifically just that's the broken route because
Yeah, so we can talk about that for just a second real quick. The road-known route, I didn't take that route. Well, I'm sure somebody was gonna ask that question. If you guys are familiar with High Lake and the Strawberries, they've been trying to get a road-known project on the ground there for, 6 years or more, 10 years. It's been a slog, and they're still not there. If I can get this done in 4 or 5 years by doing what I'm doing, like, it's way less work than trying to put a road known project on the ground. Road known projects are more expensive. They're more controversial. You may have seen the project the Forest Service was gonna do in Montana that Wilderness Watch sued them and just won and got stopped. And so they're not gonna be able to do their rainbow trout removal for, I think it was Yellowstone cutthroat, restoration. And so that got stopped. There's just so many barriers with it that we'll try it if we need to, but, like, the amount of time that I would've put into that, just the planning of it, I can potentially have this done on $5,000 and 5 years.
Well, what are the thing about is Fairley is not as super popular with it. So that helps out a lot. It's not like we're going to go up and work in a waste
Yeah.
space.
And that was part of the reason we picked Bear Lake. It's because, like, the Lost Dean Lays Basin has a bunch of lakes all scattered out throughout. Bear Lake is it in the Bear Creek Basin, so that's kind of the source. It's a lot more simple situation. You got to hike 9 or 10 miles to get there. It's way back, and not as many people go there. It's just not as popular of a spot. We see people when we're up there, but it's a couple groups going through. We didn't have anybody camp there while we were there this year. People kind of pass through and keep going. So it's not super popular. It's not like going into the Lakes Basin or somewhere and where there's 8, 10 camps around Mirror Lake, trying to get something like this done. It's the frequency of people using it's fairly low.
What is can you hear me? What is your timeline and plan for reintroduction? Are
Um,
you going to throw them back in there, the bull trout into
yeah.
there?
Well, so there's this would have all been historically fishless. Below, so those barriers that I showed you back, in that first way back, apparently right there. So there's no, those would have been historically fishless all the way above these X's. So to the south. Um, there is bull trout below there. So the hope is we can eliminate fish from falling out down to where the bull trout are. Now, back to the social side of things, I do plan on restocking this lake with triploid rainbow trout. So we do high lake stocking. We stock about 9 lakes in the wilderness every 2 years, via helicopter, and I do plan on putting fish back in this lake. But part of the reason, my thinking on that, I'm not opposed to having some fishless lakes, and if we have the ability to go out and get some more places that are off the beaten path, I'm very open to leaving some just completely fishless and let the amphibs have those back. But I don't, on the social side of things, I don't want people to be like, well, every time you do this, we lose a fishing opportunity. So we're really good at growing rainbow trout in the high lakes because they're triploids and we can control their numbers and we produce some pretty nice fish. We stocked Swamp Lake after not having fish in there for quite a few years, and we went back up there 2 years later, and the average fish was 16.5 inches. Um, and so we're really good at producing good rainbow trout fisheries. So we will put rainbow trout back in this one, or that's the plan right now. Um, and then as we move on, we'll start talking about fishless lakes and kind of returning those more to a natural state. But right now, on the social side of things, kicking it off, I'm like, let's make sure people aren't giving us the every time you do this, we lose an opportunity. And I'd like to build up a really good fishery and then be like, see, when we did that, and then we put those fish in there, and now you have 15-inch rainbows to catch in the high lakes instead of 8-inch brook trout. So
What's the distribution of brook trout in Bear Creek below the lake?
so actually, this is on this slide. They go. Mike and Laura did a bunch of electrofishing in there in 2021. It was systematic, all the way up the basin, and there's brook trout. This is the where they were St. Patrick. Once they got below there, they weren't seeing any brook trout down there. I mean, they certainly have access to it, but this is fairly typical of what we see in some other streams. Brook trout up high, really dense next to the lakes and the headwaters, and then as you move down, where you start getting into salmon and steelhead, not very many brook trout. And we've actually done a little bit of lit review, and we're finding out that brook trout and Chinook don't mix very well. They tend to run them off a little bit. There's a paper out of Idaho where they were stocking hatchery Chinook into a stream, and brook trout essentially disappeared. And so we've actually looked at that as a method a little bit. But so as you kind of move down in these systems, this is pretty typical. The Lostine River we kind of saw the same thing. Mike did a bunch of work up in there in the same year, and as you move down, they kind of petered out and they weren't there. We do catch brook trout in the screw trap in the Lostine. It's typically in the fall after the spawn, but it's not very many. They're pretty thin down low.
But I mean, that's where you're going to have the problems with the interactions with bull trout.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
But what I'm arguing is that this is the source, and these fish are coming from the top. Where if they're not competing well down there right now, then they're less, and we don't have this pure source population coming in on top of them the whole time. If we can just reduce that, we don't have to, like, I mean, it'd be awesome to completely eliminate them, but my effort is more aimed at reducing the density of them, to where we're not having as many interactions with salmon, steelhead, and bull trout in those places. And I wouldn't suspect we're going to see an increase when we don't have that source population up there. I'd suspect that would either stabilize or even decrease a little.
unless you have brook trout spawning below the lake.
Yeah, which we do already. We always have. So it's the effort is to improve the condition, right? Like, I don't know why we would see those fish increase in that reach down there.
On that note about
Oh.
Hey, thanks.
Hey.
On that note about reducing as opposed to eliminating, is there like a threshold where you get these fish below, and can you maintain the populations low through I don't know, maybe there's alternative management regimes. And the reason I ask that is because it would maybe allow you to do a minimal amount of effort and do more lakes.
Yes. So when Mike and Laura did that work in there, that systematic electrofishing, they did habitat surveys and they have densities for all that. And we are going to go in at some point. Hopefully we can find some money to do this stuff. But Laura's been looking at doing more of the work on the monitoring side. I'm kind of trying to stay in the management action lane. But we will go down to those sites, and we're going to resample those and see if our densities are changing as this goes on. And occasionally we can go check those out and see if we're seeing a reduction. So it's kind of played by ear as we go down through that section to see if we see a decrease in there. We do know that from their work that down in that, once you get kind of off the first major drop about 1 kilometer from the lake, it hits the bottom of the valley and it's flatter, and there's meadows and deep holes and stuff like that. It's going to be really hard to get fish out of there. But my hope is that by removing the source population, we'll see that decrease. If not, then we'll start working on the next phase of like say chemical removal. Or so these guys that I stole the idea from, they actually have the creek below the lake. They eliminated brook trout there just by electrofishing. They were doing like 4 passes a year of just super intense electrofishing, and they were able to be successful there. We don't have that kind of resources right now. We'd have to go out and find something, but there's some options out there. We've talked about, like I said, Chinook or coho up there. We're already releasing trying to reintroduce coho to the basin, but doing some stuff like that. And harebrained schemes. So when I say harebrained schemes, this used to rest in a file on my computer called harebrained schemes. So and strangely enough, that folder is empty and everything's being implemented right now. So which is kind of fun. But yeah. Oh.
Have you thought of introducing the triploids a little early to help clean up the young of the year?
Yeah. That was in our original kind of plan. I'd like to see where we end up and then kind of reevaluate, and that's still an option. His introducing either, we've talked about either the triploids. The ones we use we call them crane bows. They came from Crane Prairie, and the Bend office probably 15 years ago took some wild fish and started a new stock of rainbows, but they're fairly predatory. And so we've considered that of like, if we get down to where we just have a few young of the year and we're just struggling to kind of clean it up. Maybe we just saturate it with those triploids and let the competition do its thing and hopefully get there, because we can continue to bring those fish in and keep stocking them on top of them. One of the other things that just has not come along like I was hoping it was the YY Brook Trout. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but they're an all male 2Y chromosome fish, and the idea is you stock them somewhere and skew your sexes so hard that the population tanks. And there's some work going on that, but that relies, the modeling that was done on the original paper for that relies on removal, and they suggest about a 50% removal every year. Well, we're going to far exceed that by the time we're done. So if you can hit a 97% removal and then bring in 2,000 triploids and just basically every offspring becomes a male, you're sitting pretty good. So there's options out there. We're just kind of in the first phases of this, and then if we don't get to the finish line with just nets and electrofishing, we'll see what the options are and go from there. So you better run, Kelly.
Kind of on the same line, thinking about the young of the year removal, is there any chance or reason to try to go in and disturb the reds prior to hatching or doing something like that to try to get rid of them before they actually hatch? Or is it like not accessible during that time of year? Or is that too much effort? Like, have you thought about that side of things?
We have part of the problem is the spawn timing of this fish, I think, is pretty prolonged. We see there's a pond in Enterprise that we see brook trout spawning in it into December. So this sits at almost 8,000 feet. It's not going to be accessible during that time. If we're up there in October when fish are starting to spawn, we'll certainly do that. We've thought about going in there and doing that. I just don't know that we're going to be super successful at it. But if I see a red, I mean, every fish has got to go. Um, so yes, if we're there, but we have been electrofishing what we suspect are the spawning tributaries. There's probably some spawning going on in the lake, but we have been electrofishing trying to keep those fish out of there. So we're not, and there was, from the time that Laura and I were electrofishing up there, we did get a few larger fish in the tributaries, and when they went up in September, there was not very many large fish still. So they are staying out of there for at least a little bit. Significantly there's a, the flow is significantly reduced in the fall. So when we're in there in July, it's really spring up there. So there's still a little bit of water around. We're putting our beers in the snowbanks, and they're there, and so you can have cold beer at night. But so some of these tributaries aren't very accessible by the time they get to that time of year because the flow is so low.